Welcome to the China Memo. We make unbiased observations on structural trends. I'm your host, born in China, trained in Western finance. Here is a number that doesn't get talked about enough. China has built nearly 48,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, more than Germany, Japan, and the United Kingdom combined. It is, by any measure, the largest high-speed rail network ever constructed, built in roughly 20 years, on a scale that no other country has attempted or matched. Now, here is another number. Of that entire network, approximately 6% is profitable. 6%. The other 94% does not cover its costs. The flagship line, Beijing to Shanghai, the most traveled high-speed corridor in the world, is expected to take roughly 20 years to earn back its original investment. And that's the best performing line in the system. Today, I want to use China's high-speed rail as a lens, not on infrastructure, but on something bigger, on how China makes bets at a national scale, who pays when those bets don't pencil out, and what the balance sheet looks like after 2 decades of building the future at full speed. Before we get into the numbers, let's establish what this network was actually designed to do, because it was never purely a transport project. High-speed rail in China was conceived as an instrument of national integration. The idea: connect cities, compress distance, and pull inland regions into economic orbit of the coast. In a country in China's geographic scale, that's not a small ambition. Getting from Beijing to Shanghai used to take 10 hours by conventional rail. The high-speed line does it in 4.5. Think of it less like a train network and more like a rewriting of economic geography. When you cut travel time between cities by half, you change which firms can work together, which workers can commute where, and which cities become magnets for investment. That was the logic. Over roughly 20 years, that plan turned into a grid that now covers more track than any other country on Earth. The question, and it's the one that's finally being asked openly inside China, is what did that grid actually deliver, and at what cost? Let me start with the honest case for the network, because there is one. World Bank research shows that when you cut travel time and cost inside a dense economic region, they studied parts of coastal Guangdong, average worker productivity can rise by around 10%. On certain lines, the clustering effect, which is the economic benefit of firms and workers concentrating in connected hubs, is worth somewhere between 0.5% and 1% of a city's GDP each year. In other words, the trains do something real. They help firms find better suppliers, workers find better jobs, and cities attract more activity. That's not marketing language, that's measured output in the research. But, and this is the part that gets glossed over, those gains are not evenly distributed. The biggest winners are already developed, more urban areas with strong service sectors. Cities that were already magnets become stronger magnets. The high-speed station arrives, and people with skills, capital, and options use it to move toward opportunity, which tends to mean toward the big hubs, not away from them. Think of it like this. If you build a fast road between a large city and a small town, you might expect the small town to benefit from better access to markets. What often happens instead is that the talented people in the small town use the road to leave. The connectivity flows both ways, and the capital and the people tend to flow in one direction. The network, in that sense, is also a map of divergence. Big hubs get bigger. Many smaller inland stops become exactly that, stops. Now, let's talk about the balance sheet. And I want to be precise here, because the scale is easy to underestimate. The high-speed rail system carries an estimated $839 billion in debt. That figure has been cited across multiple analyst reports and is considered a conservative estimate by some researchers. The operator, China Railway, the state-owned entity that runs the national network, has been loss-making for years, relying on central government support to keep operating. Of roughly 45,000 kilometers of track, only around 2,300 kilometers, that 6% figure, generate enough passenger revenue to cover their costs. 16 major lines have been analyzed in detail. 6 coastal routes make money, the rest do not. Beijing to Shanghai, the busiest and the most commercially viable corridor in the country, still needs approximately 20 years to recoup its construction costs. Let me translate that into plain terms. You build a line, it costs tens of billions. It fills up with passengers, it runs efficiently, and it still takes 2 decades to break even on the capital you spent. That is the best case in the system. Now consider what that implies for the lines that run through inland provinces with lower population density, slower economies, and weaker passenger demand. Those lines were built on the same model, heavy upfront capital, long payback horizons, but with a fraction of the commercial rationale. The question of who funds those losses brings us to the part of the story that rarely make it into the headline numbers. Behind the network's balance sheet are local governments. And behind the local governments are their financing arms, called LGFVs, or Local Government Financing Vehicles. In other words, LGFVs are entities set up by local governments specifically to borrow money for infrastructure projects. Money that doesn't show up directly on the government's official accounts. Think of them as a shadow balance sheet. The debt is real, the transparency is not. A recent study puts combined local government and LGFV debt at around 100 trillion yuan. 100 trillion yuan, at the time we speak, which is April 2026, is roughly $14.5 trillion. To put that in context, that is larger than China's entire annual GDP. And a significant share of that debt is tied to infrastructure. Rail, roads, urban development projects, much of it in inland provinces that build ambitiously and now carry the weight of it. Here is the structural tension. There's a geographic irony here. The inland provinces that needed the connectivity the most are the ones least equipped to service the debt required to build it. They borrowed heavily through LGFVs, found lines with relatively weak passenger demand. The train arrived, the debt stayed. That's not a fringe dynamic. That is the architecture of a significant portion of China's local fiscal stress. And it connects directly to the broader property and the local government debt story. The same financing vehicles, the same structural imbalance between what was built and what can be repaid. Now, here's the interesting part. For the first time in a long time, this question is being asked openly inside China. Ahead of the 2026 to 2030 5-year plan, officials and analysts are publicly debating whether all proposed new high-speed lines actually meet the criteria for central approval, and whether the country now needs something entirely different. The argument from transport economists like Zhao Jian is worth listening to carefully. China is, above all else, a manufacturing economy. It moves vast quantities of raw materials, components, and finished goods across enormous distances. High-speed passenger rail does almost nothing to ease those freight bottlenecks. What China may actually need more of, the argument goes, is heavy freight rail capacity. The kind that moves bulk goods, not business travelers. The debate is not high-speed rail was a mistake. The debate is more precise than that. How much more, where, at what cost, and for whose benefit? Those are the questions circulating in policy circles right now, and the answers, or the absence of clear answers, will show up in project approvals, cancellations, and financing rules over the next several years. That shift in tone from expansion to scrutiny is itself a signal worth noting. Let me offer 3 grounded observations, not predictions, purely lenses. The first is the trade-off between growth and leverage, and why it's harder to resolve than it looks. The network delivers real economic value, measurable productivity gains, denser urban clusters, faster movement of people and ideas. That is not in dispute. But it delivers those gains as social returns. Diffuse benefits spread across regions and sectors over decades, while concentrating financial costs in specific institutions. State-owned rail operators, local governments, LGFVs, and ultimately the central government's implicit guarantee behind all of them. In other words, the benefits are real but hard to price. The debts are also real and very easy to price. When a state decides to build infrastructure that generates high social returns but low financial returns, it is making a deliberate choice to absorb the gap. China has made that choice consistently and at scale. The question is not whether that was right or wrong. It is what happens to the capacity to keep absorbing that gap as local governments' fiscal stress accumulates and the property sector simultaneously contracts. The two stories, high-speed rail debt and the property bust, are not separate. They share the same underlying architecture of local borrowing, deferred loss recognition, and the central government as backup. The second observation is geographic, and it matters for anyone thinking about where economic activity inside China concentrates over the next decade. The corridors that work, Beijing to Shanghai, the coastal routes, the Pearl River Delta connections, are likely to remain what I would call rail advantaged. High connectivity, dense economic activity, self-reinforcing clusters of talent and capital. Those corridors will continue to be the spine of China's most productive urban economy. The inland routes are a different picture. In many cases, the train passes through, the fiscal pressure stays behind. Local governments in those regions are carrying rail-related debt on lines that don't generate enough revenue to justify the cost. Meanwhile, facing declining land sales revenue from the property sector. If you want the rough map of where fiscal stress is most likely to surface inside China, follow the combination of low-demand high-speed rail lines and high LGFV debt loads. Those two variables together identify the regions that over-invested in connectivity relative to their economic base, and that are now living with the consequences. That's not a commentary on whether building those lines was wise. It's an observation about where the pressure accumulates. The third observation is forward-looking, and it's about what the next few years of policy decisions will actually reveal. Watch three things. First, project approvals and cancellations. If Beijing tightens the criteria for new high-speed lines, particularly in lower demand inland regions, that signals a genuine shift from expansion to consolidation. If approvals keep flowing regardless, the political economy of infrastructure spending is still winning over the fiscal logic. Second, fair policy and cross-subsidy. The profitable coastal routes effectively subsidize the rest of the network. Watch for any changes to fare structures or operating rules that alter how that cross-subsidy flows. If Beijing starts pricing popular routes higher to cover losses elsewhere, that tells you something about how tight the overall system is becoming. Third, LGFV debt restructuring rules. This is the least visible but the most consequential signal. When and how the central government decides to absorb, restructure, or roll over the rail-related debt sitting inside local financing vehicles will determine how much of this cost ultimately lands on the national balance sheet and on what terms. Taken together, these three signals will tell you something important. Whether China treats what it has built as an asset to optimize or continues to treat expansion itself as the goal, even as the fiscal architecture that funded it comes under increasing strain. So here's where this lands. China's high-speed rail network is a genuine engineering achievement and also a genuine financial problem, simultaneously and not in ways that cancel each other out. It shortened distance, it lifted productivity in the right corridors, it hardwired new urban clusters into the economic map of the country. Those things are real. It also added hundreds of billions in debt to a system of local governments already under stress from the property bust. It concentrated gains in hubs that were already winning. On the other hand, it left a long tail of inland provinces carrying obligations that their economic base may never fully support. The question for the next decade is not whether the network was worth building. That argument is largely settled, and the tracks are still in the ground. The question is whether China decides what it has is enough and turns its attention to using it better, or whether it keeps adding lines and leverage to a system that is already showing the weight of both. That answer will come not from speeches, but from the project list, the debt rules, and the balance sheets of the governments that signed the original contracts. This is the China Memo. Until next time. Before I go, nothing in this episode constitutes investment advice, a trade recommendation, or a solicitation to buy or sell any security. The China Memo is produced for informational and educational purposes only. All views are analytical observations based on publicly available sources. For any financial or business decisions, please consult qualified independent professionals.